Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the third issue of the Shape Journal, dedicated to the centenary of Vladimir Lenin's death. In the previous two issues on this topic, we looked at the legacy of Lenin's theory. We asked last time what is to be done now, and there was a focus on the present. And in this issue, we're going to have a look at the future. What's the future of Leninism? What's the future generally of the current situation? We'll be drawing on things such as Marx's theory of history, the idea of the end of history, asking whether a Marxist revolution is possible at the moment and what is needed in the future to make it possible. The discussion today, as always, will be with Jim Schofield, Marxist theorist and physicist, who I'm sure will have some strong ideas and opinions on Leninism and its potential future. My first question for Jim Schofield would be, what does a future of Leninism potentially look like from this point? And what problems might there be in realising that?
Well, I think the most important thing from my point of view is that it's not just politics. Without any doubt whatsoever, Lenin's contribution was in the philosophy behind Marxism. And he made some very, very important contributions. But he was very unhappy about the fact that they were limited to politics. He had no choice. For example, he knew that to be able to understand revolutions, you had to study revolutions, not in retrospect, as everyone has had to do in the past, but as they were happening. You had to be in revolutions to have a chance of understanding them. And not only that, you had to experience more than one. You had to experience many. Now that's not available, is it? That's not available in the usual sense. And therefore, if you do what historians have always done in the past, including Marx, which is to read accounts of past revolutions, you're not going to get the answers.
We can't afford to be purely retrospective anymore, can we, in the way that Marxists have been quite often. But I think there is almost a crisis of the new, or a crisis of the future, which has sort of plagued not just the left, but perhaps society in general for several decades now, where we're not seeing really the sort of pace of radical change that we saw in periods in the 20th century, that we seem to be in a period of sort of stagnation. And I kind of can't help but wondering, what would Lenin make of it if he was alive today? Where would he see the potential in the current situation? Or would he also be a bit of a left doomer? I doubt he would. But Lenin doesn't strike me as the kind of person to wallow in self-pity. I think he'd see something, wouldn't he? He'd see some potential in the current situation if he was here now.
I've always meant to try and find out how one could carry on the tradition of Lenin in the way that he would have done if he'd have survived 1924. And I think it's more general than just politics. I think it's change. Now, it wasn't new. Hegel had insisted that change was the important thing in history, in understanding development. And he talked about 3 different ways that change occurred. Quantitative change, cyclic change, and then finally, the third and most important group, which was qualitative change. Now, I don't like calling it just that. I call it the emergence of the wholly new, because that's what it is. And in that third category, you have the explanations for revolutions, and you can't take the explanation of one revolution and apply it to another. You can't do that. There's too much going on in a revolution to do that. And they'll be entirely different. You go to different revolutions and you'll find that they don't happen the same way at all. And they can't. And the reason is, and it fitted in with Lenin going to see the physicists, is you've got to try and find out what's happening at all levels of change. Now, mostly, the only things that you see changing are the big things. But in revolution, that is not the case. What happens is that various things in society are changing, but at different rates. Some of them are very quick, and some of them are much slower. And they very rarely coincide when they're changing. But you can get a couple, say, coming together and affecting one another. Now, what a revolution is when you don't just get a couple, you get a whole lot. And they've been out of phase for most of history. And then in a revolution, they come into phase. And the important thing that happens is that you get changes you could get nowhere else. They're not changes within a development, a single development. They're changes across different developments that rarely coincide. That's why you've got to study revolutions. And it's impossible for an individual to do so because they don't happen every 5 minutes.
We've certainly been waiting a long time now for the next one, haven't we? You know, I mean, I think this is where you get a lot of the kind of negativity around this on the left. And, you know, you get the idea that, you know, perhaps this is not an age of revolution and we're going to have to wait a long time for the next stage of revolution to appear. And will we even recognize it when it does materialize? What should we even be looking for as clues that we might be moving towards a phase of history where radical change can happen again?
Well, I think we're in one now, and we're not recognizing it. And it's not surprising. As time goes on, more and more elements affect change. If you think about going back to elementary particles, you've just got particles either colliding or affecting one another. Very, very, very simple relationships. Now, from the initial state of things, way, way, way back, millions of years, to now, there's been a growth in kinds of change. And what really makes them so new is that when you've got a string of changes in one part and a string of changes elsewhere, if they coincide, the two kinds of change affect one another and create the wholly new. There's no easy way of analysing it if you're stuck on the changes of the past. There isn't.
I mean, if we're saying like how this might translate into praxis, you know, how can we use these theoretical ideas to help equip the revolutionaries of the future? It sounds like an intractable mess that someone's got to try and spot these infinitesimally small changes in. How do we know? How can we know what it is that we should be backing or what it is that we should be putting our energy into? It can seem like an impossible task, can't it?
Well, yeah, it can, but you've got to remember there was a man who did it. It was Lenin. And he knew what the problem was way back then. That's why he'd gone to physicists to try and get some help. Since
Lenin's time, as we've alluded to already in this conversation, change itself has changed. You know, we've had, the economic systems have got more complicated. There are new things have emerged which are now changing that Lenin couldn't even have dreamed of in 1917. So a contemporary or a future revolutionary is presented with an entirely new set of problems to try and work out. And I think this is where Marxist theory is lacking, because if you're a revolutionary right now, or wanted to be one, you probably wouldn't even know where to start.
It's true. It's true. But I think it was made clear by Lenin he just couldn't do it. He died too soon in 1924. He more or less intimated that everything changes in this manner, not just politics. Politics is, of course, important because it's about society and it affects everyone in that society. But it affects everything that changes.
I think when we were talking earlier, one of the things that came up in terms of things that you might need to equip a future revolutionary, or even just a Marxist theorist trying to sort out what's going on today, is that they've got to have enough information to understand what's changing, and these things can be quite hidden or intertwined in very complex ways. So how do we get the information that we need to try and understand these things? I think one of the things that is a real problem and will only get worse as we move into the future, I think, is that information is harder and harder to trust. That we have a crisis of information. So how can someone who's trying to understand social and political or economic situations, how can they navigate this and get the information they need to understand what's changing and where revolutionary opportunities might emerge? I feel like information is
I think that the only way it can be done is by broadening the study well beyond politics. Now, I was trained as a physicist. That's what I am. I'm supposed to be a physicist. So you see change happening in physics. And you see that in order to use physics, they nail it to the floor in production. They don't use nature as it is naturally. They use a pinned-down version of it so they can predict it. But you've got to study nature as it changes all by itself, and not just in politics, but in everything. Now, once you do that, because of all the different paces that will happen in all the different areas, you will get information from one area that's not yet happened in the area you're most interested in, but it will be relevant to it. It'll be at a different phase, maybe a later phase. You have to study change generally, not specifically alone. You haven't got to just be a politician, which is what they thought you had to be in Lenin's time. You've got to be a philosopher of change. You've just got to be. If you don't do that, there's no way you can be prepared to analyse what's happening.
Not just analyse, but act, I guess, in the right way when crucial opportunities arise. Because I think that's definitely what Lenin was good at. He could read the room. He understood where things were going, and then he could act at the right time to enact meaningful changes, or to at least encourage things to move in the right direction. I think that's the kind of active intelligence that's required, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'd say another thing too. You have to bring in knowledge from other areas, because change is general, happens to everything. So it's no good just doing politics and economics and history, so on. You've got to get an idea of all the kinds of change that can occur. And it's only by having a department, if you like, that studies change. And they study change in all the areas, the sciences, the arts, politics, the lot. And they get discussions among those people. I mean, if you talk to someone about great literature, you find that they're talking about someone who was writing a story, say, but it showed tremendous profundity of understanding if it was good literature. That's relevant. Because what people thought were fixed or unchanging changed, and somebody saw it and could see why.
I think a lot of good, like the best literature, has a dialectical aspect to it. There are often various different contending forces and contradictions and paradoxes that work themselves out because that reflects the complexity of reality. And good literature embodies that, I think, in a way that science regularly fails to.
Well, science looks away on purpose. Come on, let's say it as it is. And what they do is they pin down a situation to a narrow range of possibilities. They keep it within that range. They work like heck. They make sure the environment stays the same, the temperature stays the same, the humidity is the same. They don't let things change except the ones that they want to change. And they find relationships between the changes that they're allowing. Now that is no good if the things that are changing are something else. You'll miss it. So this is why I insist upon this broadening idea, because the only way you can actually continue to cope is by not restricting study. Experiments, as I was forced to do for my whole career, are wrong. They give you what happens in a fixed, controlled situation that you don't let wander, and it's used only in production in a factory. That's not what you're after. You're after understanding change, why a change occurs, not just how, and not just for one particular output. It's a very, very different question.
I suppose as well, like if we're comparing literature and science as different ways of approaching reality, the one that regularly deals with and even gives us the wholly new is the creative discipline of writing itself. Like you do have emergencies in writing where people say things that have never been said before. People notice patterns in profound patterns that have never been expressed.
And they've got to be there. The emergence of the wholly new is the essence of change. It may not seem so when you're just looking at what happens in a factory or what happens in an experiment, but when you're looking at the world, when you're looking at space, when you're looking at the countryside, when you're looking at everything really, you've got these changes and they're not under control and they're not within a limited range. They're new and you've got to tackle them. Now, if you try and explain the wholly new just within the place where it's happened, you'll never get your answer. You get your answer by looking at wholly news across a vast range of things. Quite a very, very large range. And you see all sorts of outcomes here, there and everywhere. And you look at the causes or the seeming causes in all those various cases, and you say, is there any of these that relate to the one I'm trying to understand? And there'll always be something. And the other thing that we haven't mentioned so far is that whatever you think is your theory, it will be wrong because you haven't got everything. It'll be right, perhaps, in a range of circumstances. But you have to face the fact that when you do find a relationship, it isn't an eternal truth. It's a truth in the context in which you were working only.
I mean, I think time is often missing from people's conception of things. They think if they find something is true, there's an assumption that that is somehow eternally true. And time is completely missing from our understanding of things. Something can be true for a split second, and then the next second it's not.
Absolutely.
So I feel like time is often, and I guess dialectics is an important way of unpacking the role of time within.
Well, I mean, that's why Hegel was so good, because he started the process. He didn't finish it by any measure of means. But you notice the people who followed, they all go back to Hegel. And some of the changes that happen are so unusual that most people just ignore them. You can get things changing into their opposite. You give me an easy explanation for something becoming what seems to be its exact opposite. Well, with the stuff you've got, the normal measurements, you won't know. But there's other things happening. There's lots going on in most situations. And what scientists do, it's old as science, is you stop most things happening. You do it in a lab, you control everything, and you find out a law for that lab at that time in those circumstances. But that's not always sufficient, is it? If you go into very different circumstances, it'll be a different law. It'll be different relationships. And what's more, everything is developing. Now, this is the thing that people leave out. Things are not fixed at all. They're in process of change. Sometimes it's very, very slow, but it's always there. And it's no good having a science that doesn't take into account development, because it's always happening. And it means that what you think is the truth today may not be the truth tomorrow.
And rarely is. I mean, if we're talking about an economic system that is in crisis at the moment, we talked about a crisis of the new, but to have the new, you need a crisis. And so maybe that's what we've got now. How do you see things playing out from this point on in terms of it being a period of crisis? Does that mean it's in a period of emergence as well?
Oh, yeah. It's guaranteed to be so. In fact, contention is the mother of change. You get the wholly new out of contention, which fails.
I mean, if we look at the idea of the future from a Marxist perspective, from a dialectical materialist perspective, and we've said often that you can't predict how an emergence will play out, or you can't predict when the wholly new is going to arrive. Is talking about the future kind of pointless from a Marxist perspective, because there's no way of second guessing what's going to happen anyway? Or do you think that's too much of a reductionist reading of the ideas, and that we should still talk about futures?
Oh, I think you've got to give people somewhere to aim.
Yeah.
But you've got to find the good in change, or what would be considered good by most people, and you do trumpet that. You make it clear that that could happen. But you also make it clear that unless the right things are done, it could go another way. So you show the possibilities of change for ordinary people. And you also show how it can be deflected elsewhere.
We've already discussed the importance of change, but I think one of the things that we could probably drill into a bit further is that change is something that is often desired on the left, but can be hard to elicit, and many people observe a kind of lack of progressive or critical change in the current political situation. Is that true, or are we just misunderstanding change if we look at what's happening today and see a lack of change? Is that just our misunderstanding?
No, it's perfectly true. And I think it's true because real change is of this particular nature. what happens is you get a conjunction of all sorts of forces that are happening in society that come together, that impact upon one another and cause some sort of change, most of which are, of course, irrelevant and don't last. But occasionally, very rarely, you can get a change that is productive. Now, you can't say why it's productive, but you'll notice it is. Things happen thereafter, caused by this change. And if you try and explain it, you'll fail. But what you've got to do is you've got to have certain purposes. You've got to be on the side of the right people, the class, the working class. And you've got to look to their future and their lives and everything and make them better. And when you do that and you come up with policies, they'll probably not work. But in doing so, you'll prove that you're on the side of the class and you'll learn something from it. Now, one of the amazing things that Lenin found when he was the only one doing this in the Russian Revolution was that even though most of his predictions in the course of a revolution where changes were happening every few days were wrong, and the actions that he tried to implement with the team, right? He got, his team together who agreed with him, and they tried to intervene. Generally, it didn't work. But they learned, and they hung in there. And even though most of their seeming conclusions and objectives didn't carry through, they just didn't happen. It was impossible to predict the future. They did get somewhere. And in the end, Russia had its revolution.
So I think if we were to try and take a general principle from that experience of Lenin's, obviously the reason we can't predict the future is because, as you said, we can't really predict emergent change. So we're always, to an extent, playing catch-up with unfolding events. So a Leninist approach to the future isn't to try and predict it, but to try and shape events as they're happening, or to try and nudge things in fortuitous directions.
That's all they can do. And the point is, if they're dedicated and they've got to have a lot of knowledge, you don't just do it out of desire. You've got to have a lot of knowledge. But if you keep to it, and you've always got an intent for the most downtrodden class in society, you'll get somewhere. It's because you're going in the right direction. You'll do a lot of wrong things, but you'll have the class on your side, and they are the majority.
Do you think this is something that the left has forgotten, or perhaps never really knew in the first place?
Yeah, they never knew it. They never knew it. I mean, I was in various political parties, Communist Party, Trotskyist movement, and so on, and they were rubbish. I'm not being silly here. They really were, because I'd asked them questions and they didn't know the answer, and they'd be annoyed at me asking those particular questions. Very annoyed. They'd say, "It's no good you asking such questions like that. Who knows, The point is, Lenin knew how to find some things out. And he didn't do it by having the answers before he started. He did it by having some of the answers at the end of trying. And the most important answer of all, he occasionally got: a victorious revolution.
So I guess you could describe it as a, for want of a better word, a sort of experimental process.
Yes, of course it is.
You've got to just try things out and then learn.
It is, but it's very disciplined, and it's also very directed. You know who his biggest enemies were, Lenin? They were the theoreticians in Marxist theoreticians in the party. They worked it out in their heads, and they knew which way to go, and they were always wrong. What Lenin did was he knew whose side he was on, right? And he made sure he was in it up to his neck. And he'd work out policies with his team, and they'd try and implement them, and they wouldn't work, but they'd learn all the time. And at the end of a revolutionary series of events, which were always fantastically powerfully informing, they could get somewhere. But it's retrospective. They don't really know what to do and do it. They're finding the path. And it's a new path that no one's ever traversed before. How can you say, why don't you run down the path? You don't know where it is. You have to find it.
And so to kind of shepherd this into a bigger question, do we think that the reason why capitalism has lasted so long is that a failure of left-wingers and revolutionaries to understand some of these principles? Or is it something that we've misunderstood about the nature of this system? What is it? What are we getting wrong here as Marxists, as Leninists?
I don't think, because poor old Lenin died very, very young, he didn't complete his job. He didn't. He knew he didn't. He did as much as he could, but he didn't complete it. And none of the rest of the Bolsheviks were proper Marxists. And some of them were opponents, like Trotsky, for example, Zinoviev, Kamenev, all sorts of members of the party were really a damn nuisance. Yeah. And he had to fight like hell. Now, the only reason Lenin learned something was because he set up parties, or got them to set up their own parties, in all the ex-colonies of Russia. Their own parties. And they didn't just do what the Russian Communist Party did. They found their own route and had their own revolutions. He was on the right track. But the one thing he'd wanted to do was to look at change in general to inform his theory. And he never managed to do that.
And do we think that that's the core sort of failure that has allowed capitalism to have almost like an extended afterlife?
Yeah.
Is that how we?
What we've got to do as real Leninists is apply this theory of change, original change, new change, to all the sciences. He tried to see if he could do it in physics. The answer was no. They were miles wrong. He went to the best physicists in the world, in Britain and Germany. They were no good for this sort of change. No, Marxists cannot afford to only concentrate on social change. To be able to understand social change, the hardest of all changes to understand, they've got to look at other changes, because all of the changes have elements of these features in them.
And you've got to say that the left has largely failed to understand recent social changes. I mean, they were, if we're going to take a very recent event, they're largely blindsided by Trump's win, for example. There wasn't a huge kind of expectation or understanding for why that's happened in America.
I don't think anyone understands it, to be honest.
Well, I think I have a little theory. You can feel free to smash this down if you think I'm wrong. But I think I think people do want change, and the political class and the economic systems that we have are completely immune to it. I mean, even the slightest change in economics elicits panic in the markets and everything. So it's a very conservative, technocratic way of doing politics across the spectrum. And then you've got someone like Trump who comes in, even though he's completely self-interested and far right, and doesn't have the interests of anyone apart from himself.
in his mind, because he comes in like a bulldozer, people see that as a possible vehicle for change, because everyone
Whether
else,
he likes it or not, he reveals things
yeah,
by his actions.
of course,
It's not his plan,
no,
but he reveals them. They never reveal these things,
no.
right? And one of the things that Lenin was beginning to learn was that you've got to intervene and reveal things. Then you might get some inkling of what's going on. But it's a big job. And there is nobody yet trained in this. And certainly nobody applies it in all the other things, all the sciences, all the other skills and areas of knowledge. Nobody applies it anywhere.
We've discussed before the limitations of what's possible with this research here and the work that we can do with SHAPE. What needs to happen to push this beyond SHAPE and create a penumbra of people, I guess, who are really tackling these questions, taking up the mantle of Lenin's unfinished work, and trying to develop, what we've talked about before, which I guess is a sort of science of change, really, that's necessary. What would you hope, Jim, from other people in this contribution? What would you hope other people could bring to it?
Well, it's interesting because you usually hear that what you're expecting is a positive response, but that isn't what I'm looking for.
No.
I'm looking for contention, really, because it's my opinion that you don't really make progress without an argument, without a discussion where people say, "Oh, I don't agree with that," and they say why. And in answering their complaints, you get further than you ever would if you're just saying it from your own basis. Contention is essential. Now, I was a teacher all my life, and the time I started making a lot of ground was when I did question and answer as the main part of my teaching. Not the lecture, the question and answer. Because when you take a class and you're presenting them with something new, they always have questions or complaints or disagreements.
Definitely have complaints.
and it makes it. It really does. Because if you have to take a complaint and make sense out of it for them and convince them, you have to do a good job. So it draws out of you things you didn't know you had.
And I guess as well, like contention and questioning the ground on which the other person is coming from is key to the whole sort of dialectics project, isn't it, really?
Oh, indeed. Indeed. In fact, I don't say it very often. I don't mention dialectics every second sentence or anything silly like that. But it is at the heart of things. Things are not straightforward and buildable in a straight line of logic. They're not. It'd be nice if they were, but they're not. And people who work entirely in those forms, like mathematicians, for example, and the reason I can be critical of that is because that's what I am, a mathematician. They build in a straight line, and they don't go into anywhere new, and they don't touch anything profound. It's extremely limited sort of understanding of the world.
So if we were going to use this platform to sort of extend an invitation to other people to try and tackle this work, would mathematicians be involved or not?
No. Because I'm a mathematician, and I've known mathematicians for a long, long time. I was a very top maths person at school and at university. And to be honest, I don't do maths now. There's not enough in it. It's too narrow and formal. And what's it for? calculating your wages. I mean, no, I don't look for maths. I look for discussion, which seems to allow the wholly new to emerge. That's what I look for.
I mean, I think so. Even maybe mathematicians aren't the people we're trying to reach with this discussion.
Oh, no.
I mean, I think we're still looking for an interdisciplinary approach from people, aren't we? It's like, I mean, obviously, the first people you'd invite are people who are probably already Marxists of some form or another. But what about scientists? What about artists? What about sociologists? So there are other people that we'd want to try and get involved in a broader discussion of the science of change and of Lenin's unfinished business.
Well, the reason I'll answer that in a particular way is because it's from my experience. You see, though I am a mathematician and a scientist and a philosopher, I was always also an artist. From being a lad, I used to draw and so on, and then I started painting. And throughout my adult life, I've been a sculptor. Now, I don't discount that. That isn't just an entertainment. I thought that doing art was very important indeed, and still do. The only trouble is I'm getting too old to do it now. But no, I think that you've got to bring in all sorts of things and not limit it to the usual narrow lanes of discussion. Because let's face it, that's what most things are on the internet, narrow lanes of discussion. Even when you get a brains trust of philosophers sitting round a table and doing a discussion for the public, it's often very, very restricted.
Do you think that's because they're dumbing it down for a public audience, or do you think there is just their discipline is that restricted?
I think their discipline is that restricted. I really do. Because don't forget, I've been in universities now since, what would it be, 78. It's a long time ago, isn't it? And so I've always talked to other university people, but it's very rare to find anyone who wants to talk to you.
That's true. Yeah, no, if you've got anything serious to talk about.
As soon as you start talking seriously, they say, oh, I've really got to go now, it's meeting someone, or you can't get a proper discussion with people.
I think the difficult thing, from my experience of working in universities, there's always a push to try and do interdisciplinary research projects or transdisciplinary research projects. But then when you get people together, get an artist and a physicist together or whatever, they don't know how to talk to each other.
To the heck. No idea.
And so, I don't know, I mean, obviously, I think what we're talking about does need an interdisciplinary approach, but I think we probably need to rethink what that means, because when universities try and do it now, it seems like a bit of a gimmick.
Well, it is. It's very difficult. I'll tell you what you need. You need something else. Now, in my case, it's Leninism. It's Marxism that looked for a real development based on contention. Yeah. That's what Lenin did. Now, most people who consider themselves to be philosophers don't do that. They don't do anything like that.
No.
They look for people who more or less agree with them, and they widen what they discuss, that's all. The point about real discussion is when you get contention. I'm certain of it. When people disagree with you.
I mean, I could imagine, like, say, if you got a group of people together, and some of them were artists, and some of them were scientists, and some of them were philosophers, but they were all coming together because they were interested in Marxism and maybe even particularly Leninism, they'd at least have a starting point for those discussions where they kind of at least
Not necessarily that they agreed, but they had some common philosophical ground from which to
Well, you'd
begin.
think that was the case, but the trouble is, there's been a lot of developments of people who call themselves Leninists in places like the USA. For instance, the US Communist Party
Yeah.
and various other ones like that. The latest ones, you know, the one based on Midwestern Marxism and so on. And they soon get lost. They're very disappointing.
Yeah.
They really are. All of them are disappointing.
I mean, I'm going to phrase this as a question. Is this the primary barrier to this work being developed? Is actually finding the right people who will be receptive to these sorts of ideas and willing to critique their own ground and rethink everything from the ground up? Because that's actually what's needed.
It is rare. It is rare. I mean, I've spent all my life looking for people like this, and if I find one in a year, I've done well. Really. I mean, what we're trying to do here is not link in to the world and show the world how to do it. It's link in to certain strands that exist which are looking for somewhere worthwhile to go. There are those about, but by God, it doesn't have to take a long while to find them.
This is it. I mean, it does all take a long while. I mean, we've been plugging away doing this for over 10 years, well over 10 years now.
That's true. That's true.
And, but I feel like there's an increasing sense of urgency that this work really needs to be done, doesn't it? I mean, the world's in a mess.
Oh, it's a terrible mess.
And I think
this is why I think the way that we build it, you know, the way that we get people in, has got to be much more radical than the usual methods. You can't just say what you're doing and people queue up to listen and to participate.
No.
You've got to kick them up the backside and say, you know, you're avoiding the real problems here, folks. How about this? You've got to have contention from square one, in my opinion.
Yeah. I guess the problem is, I mean, you're right. Some important arguments need to take place. But I mean, from my experience of trying to argue with people, even when I'm doing it from a point of being just trying to get to the truth, not because I've got an axe to grind, is that people still get defensive of their, you know, firmly held positions and beliefs or what they've built their career on. And that's another barrier to radically upending a lot of existing knowledge bases, is that people will defend them because that's what they've based their whole identity on.
It is. But you can't blame them. That's the way of the world.
Yeah, no, true enough. I mean, I've always thought probably the most important thing, if you genuinely want to find anything out, the first thing you've got to question is your own position, your ideological basis. If you're not critiquing yourself, how are you going to be able to critique anyone else?
But that's true, but it's hard, you know.
Yeah, no, not so easy.
In fact, I've been like that, but it's meant that I've mostly been alone.
Yeah.
A long time. You've got to remember, I was 18 when I went to university in Leeds and disagreed with the way they were teaching me physics. 18. And from then on, I did get involved in Marxism. But did I find people to be with and discuss? No, indeed. For a long time, no one at all. And even when I was in politics in what was called the Young Socialists, which was an arm of the Labour Party, it was still very, very, very lightweight, the actual content. In the end, you were more like a social worker. You were doing things that they needed doing, you know, running dances, going walks in the country, doing all sorts of things. But none of them were to do with what you wanted to discuss. you were very lucky if you managed to get them discussing something really profound. And in the end, I did it by going back to education and doing it in universities.
So, I mean, while we acknowledge that we need to bring more people into this project and that some way of continuing Lenin's unfinished philosophy is probably the most important thing that needs to happen now, particularly as we're entering, I think, a period of potentially massive change globally.
I think you're right.
And it could be revolutionary change, or it could be reactionary. Things could go back the other way. And, you know, it's almost like saying, well, what would Lenin do now? If Lenin was here in 2025, what would his first move be?
The tragedy of politics in this world is the fact that Lenin began to realize what he needed about 1907, 1908. And by 1924, he was dead. So Lenin didn't manage to do it. I think he was on the right lines, but he didn't manage to do it. And he used to have to fight like hell to get it done. I mean, he had a long, long battle with Leon Trotsky. Bloody hell. Many years. And after Lenin died, his people in his party carried on having these battles with Leon Trotsky. Mm. And Leon Trotsky finally died in 1940. Somebody put an ice axe in his head.
That was in Mexico, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Assassination,
I don't know what the motivation of the murderer was, but somebody killed him.
Well, I mean, I think people think Stalin sent an assassin, but...
I don't think so.
No.
Stalin did have to fight Trotsky, but he usually won.
And you know, Trotsky had already...
Take this into account. Who built the Soviet Union? Was it Trotsky? Was it buggery?
And he'd already been expelled, so he wasn't really presenting any sort of threat to the Soviet Union from Mexico.
He was always putting his oar in, though.
Yeah.
It really was. And he may not have been able to intervene in the Soviet Union, but he intervened in every country that had a left wing. Mm. He did. You know, Europe, most of Europe and so on.
Well, I mean, most of the so-called revolutionary parties of Western Europe, particularly the UK, were Trotskyist in nature, weren't they? They weren't Marxist Leninist.
No, they weren't. You're quite right. It wasn't part of the culture. It really wasn't.
No, and there was a rejection of Stalin, wasn't there, that coloured all of left-wing politics for a long time.
From 24 to 89, the Soviet Union continued to exist.
It's kind of remarkable, isn't it, that it survived?
And who led that? Stalin. Stalin led that. I mean, you can call him... I mean, he wasn't a posh guy. I think the anti-Stalin thing was anti-socialist. And he was the leader of a socialist country. And
well, the most successful one in history as well.
By a street.
Yeah.
What other countries lasted that long? That's a long time.
And I think one of the things that's plagued the left since the late 80s is the collapse of the Soviet Union, isn't it? I mean, it hasn't really recovered since then yet.
Well, it didn't collapse while Stalin was still there, notice. But it carried on until 89, 1991, didn't it? Mm. And then it collapsed. And it collapsed from within. The people who made it collapse were people who were abandoning Marxism. All of them.
Hmm. So in terms of like thinking of what a future might look like for this thought, I mean, I think we agree that it's essential that it is kind of, that there needs to be a rebirth really of Leninist ideas. But
Well, the key ones, I think it's the key ones, because you can always talk about Lenin and just get lost in the technicalities of dialectics, but that's not what it's about. The most important thing that Lenin was seeking was a means of finding out what caused the emergence of the wholly new. That's the key. That is definitely the key. Do you think any of the others were looking for the emergence within buggery? None of them. They all knew what the future should be. It should be X, and we'll go for it. But no, Lenin didn't know. And he wanted to find out. You've got to remember, some of the things that Lenin did, most so-called socialists condemned. He had the new economic policy, which brought capitalism back into the Soviet Union in order to try and build technical production. And it worked. And then in China, Mao found he wasn't getting anywhere building structures, so he brought in what was called there the Cultural Revolution. But what that was bringing in capitalists to make money, but in so doing to build vigorously and quickly certain sections of society that needed building. Both of them did that.
So China's still kind of on that trajectory, really.
Still is. Yeah, it's 50-50, isn't it?
Yeah, and you got to say it's a successful mix. I mean, with America's influence.
Well, it worries me, I must admit. China's mix worries me. Yeah. I'd rather have what Stalin was doing any day than what...
It's hard to know what China's doing a lot of the time.
Well, you hear some terrible tales. You really do. It's amazing that they're so successful, but they are. Mm. But there's a lot of entrepreneurs, that is capitalists who make money and make a lot of money. There are millionaires in China.
And it props up capitalism. All of the products that capitalism depends on are made there.
That's right. You've got to think very hard about China before you make it out to be the centre of the universe.
Well, it's just a weird situation where you've got probably the longest surviving, ostensibly communist country, and it's vital to the survival of capitalism.
Yes. And it is.
And that's a nice dialectical contradiction to wrap your head around, that, isn't it?
I would concentrate on what I think I can do, which is I can talk about the problem that Lenin had that he never solved, but he knew it was the key. That's what I can talk about. And that's what I've been doing all my adult life. And I haven't just done it in politics. I mean, I was a sculptor also, and a teacher.
Yeah. And all the work
I've done
physics.
piles of things that weren't directly political, but all the time, ideas that came out of Leninism, dialectical, contradiction and all that stuff. It's there. You've got to have contention if you want real development. Otherwise, you just go down a lane. A well-defined path that leads nowhere.
I mean, I think, it's hard to predict what's happening at the moment, which makes me think that we're perhaps on the cusp of some sort of emergent situation. And that's exactly when this kind of thinking is going to, like, almost Leninist style thinking is going to be really important if the left's going to survive and hopefully save the day.
We'll find out, Mick, because what we've got to do with this thing that we're trying to do on the internet is we've got to recruit people who want to do something similar to what we're saying. And I've never done it before. Don't forget, I'd spent 16 years putting papers up on the internet. 16 years. I started in, I think it was '08, and did it until 24 or 23. And that was 2 papers a week for all those years. Good God, that's a lot of papers.
Yeah, and it's all still up there.
So it's all still up there, that's right. And has that done the job? No, it hasn't. No. The best stuff we did was that latter stuff.
But yeah, the first Lenin audio issue was well received on YouTube.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah, that's a good response. That.
But it's going beyond just someone clicking something, enjoying it, liking it, and then moving on and forgetting about it. It's building something that has more
how do you do
longevity to it.
You've got to have a ground, haven't you? You've got to have an area in which you work in which they can do these things. It's not just in somebody's head, full stop. It's not. Yeah. I mean, I've used what I've got out of it in my art, my sculpture, and my writing, and my action, when I was running Young Socialist branches and all the rest of it. I've used it. I haven't actually been vastly successful, but it didn't just vanish. In fact, on the contrary, as an old man, I began to get somewhere. How about that? One of the things that always surprises me is I go on the social media on the internet, and nearly all the people who impress me are my age. Honestly. Nearly all of them are 85 or thereabouts. That's unbelievable, isn't it? And they're doing good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's worrying when all of the important people are octogenarians, though, isn't it?
That's right.
Because it's like a
it shouldn't be the case.
Next generation needs to be recruited.
It shows their failure, right?
To recruit the young.
Yeah, that's right. They should have been answering the question, how do we get most people thinking in these terms? And that hasn't been solved.
No, and it's. I think it's been a difficult thing to sell, and a worrying trend that's happening at the moment is that more and more young people are expressing right-wing views for the first time in several generations.
Yeah,
the young people seem to be moving to the right rather than the left.
It's because they're not being given anything on the left. Come on, no, I mean, it's failure of the left.
It's got to be, yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of problem that needs to be solved to further this work, isn't it? We need to get younger people thinking about this, recruit them, and
in fact, it has more than one track. It isn't just politics.
And maybe that's the way to hook people in, is not necessarily talking about politics directly, but showing how a philosophical basis should permeate everything that people are into. I think there was more of a culture of this in the mid-20th century, perhaps because the Soviet Union was still a major force in the world.
It was the Bauhaus, really. I think that one of the biggest influences on me was the German art school called the Bauhaus. Superb place, superb.
Even art movements in America or France or Britain, they often, even if they weren't, Marxist or pro-Soviet Union, they still almost had to define themselves in response to that in some way, because it was the major issue of the time. And you had avant-garde movements, and they were always left of one flavour or another, but you just don't seem to have anything like that now.
No. Well, we're going to change that, Mick.
Yeah.
Come on,
people. Get busy.